Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast with Ron and Kristin, where leadership meets entertainment. This podcast features stories with names and certain aspects that have been changed to keep submissions private. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast, where leadership meets entertainment. I'm Kristin Sokoloff, joined by my co-host, Ronnie Ward. Ron, how's it going?
I'm doing great, Kristin, and we are really excited today. We're stepping into leadership at the highest levels, inside the Pentagon, inside controversy, and inside personal conviction.
Yes, our guest is Justin Fulcher, former senior advisor to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, former member of the DOGE team under Elon Musk, co-founder of a global telehealth company, and doctoral candidate at Johns Hopkins.
All right, Justin, welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast.
Thanks for having me, y'all.
We're excited to have you here. Ron's been talking about this for some time.
Yeah. So before we delve in, full transparency, Justin is a friend of mine, which is another reason I wanted to connect. And for those of you who know, the podcast is named after my book. And Justin wrote the foreword for my book, helped me organize, and was just a real support when I was transitioning from government life to entrepreneurship. So Justin, I'm always grateful for that.
Well, and it's, it's been so incredible to see, your journey through, an idea for a book to then, now what that whole organization has turned into. It's truly incredible. So always good to catch up.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
When you say transitioning, Ron, I'm triggered by that word, just living here in the Pacific Northwest, just saying. Let's think of something else. Oh, Justin, you describe yourself as a Christian, patriot, and South Carolinian. That's a mouthful. I was thinking about that. We say, I'm from Washington, Washingtonian, South Carolinian. But anyhow, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think ultimately, when you think about, identity, a lot of people may not have, clear, concise answers to what that is, for them. And for me, I think, those elements describe a lot of core parts of, how I see myself and, how I describe, my identity in that piece. And, and they're also ordered in a particular way, right? I mean, God first, country, and then, community. Of course, family and friends all fall into that as well. But I think ultimately, being very clear about, who you are helps to kind of, anchor yourself, especially when, you're pursuing, some vision or some mission. And it's a lot easy to get distracted from those core tenets.
Boy, that's
really
true.
Is. Yeah.
So, Justin, you studied nonproliferation and terrorism at Middlebury. Serious global security network. What drew you into that world?
Well, I think, I spent a lot of time in Asia, and, I saw the rise of China firsthand and the threat to, the U.S.-led world order. I mean, we saw, how the PRC would threaten, countries, whether through, economic coercion and of course, the growing, military footprint throughout the Indo-Pacific. And so, for me, I've always been drawn to, a strong America. I think, a strong America is good for the world, and ultimately, had a lot of kind of applied, firsthand knowledge, but, wanted to really dive in and understand, kind of how, from kind of a more academic lens, like what is kind of the perspective there. And then of course, take my firsthand, perspective and meld that and really refine my view of kind of like what that looks like on a global stage.
Yeah, it's incredible. You're now pursuing, as I mentioned in the intro, a doctorate at Johns Hopkins. Why keep climbing academically? You've achieved so much already.
Yeah, I think, one of the interesting things about, pursuing the doctorate is a core part of that is, of course, writing a thesis, which, is ultimately almost like kind of writing a book. And I think, despite my belief that kind of firsthand learned experience is significantly more valuable than, just what you learn in the classroom, I think, both perspectives add value. But, from that perspective, just really pushing the focus on, writing a thesis, which, will ultimately, be well over 100 pages or so likely, it really is the discipline of like refining the thoughts and taking a lot of what I've learned and seen firsthand. And then of course, like putting that down on paper, which, you have to be super tight in your thinking to really, get that narrative out there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Justin, that's really interesting because, when I was with the government, they really pushed education. There were a lot of attorneys in the U.S. courts.
Right.
What do you think? Do you think there is a hierarchy? Do you think there's more value to demonstrated competence or academics, or do people need both?
Well, I think, people have different paths and, different strengths and opportunities to excel. And I think, I saw this firsthand in government. There are a lot of folks that are, very one-sided, leaning, one to the other and may not value it. But I tend to believe that there's a huge amount of value that can be gained from both. I'm biased in the sense that I believe like firsthand lived experience is my preference for how I learn and how I, actually have these academic ideas being tested in the wild. For me, that gives a lot more credibility. But, I think, for the longest time, many folks that have pursued, traditional educational backgrounds have been put on a pedestal. And I think you've seen that over the past decade. And we can't lose sight of how valuable that firsthand lived experience is. And I would take, personally, whether hiring somebody or, working with someone, I would place, way more credibility in the firsthand lived, actual work experience, actual life experience than just, academic learned experience. But there's value to both for sure.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. I remember, because at the bank, obviously, you don't need, I was going to college when I got hired as a manager, and they were like, yeah, you don't need that. Like, just come on and we'll get you up the, the ladder here. And it's funny. And then, for instance, I was hiring for this one role, and one gal had just graduated from Stanford, and somebody else actually had the experience in banking. And I went with the person with the experience in banking, and the Stanford gal did not handle that well. I mean, she probably hates me today still. And so I do think there is something to what you're saying there, for sure.
Yeah, I do as well.
Yeah.
So, Justin, let's go a little bit deeper here. Can strong conviction ever become a liability in leadership?
I think it certainly can. And I think, there's a lot of different styles of leadership. And of course, talking to someone who's literally written a book on leadership, want to give you credit there. But from my perspective, I think sometimes it can. I think ultimately you got to know when that strong conviction matters most. And I think on some of these non-negotiables, like really the mission and the why and the absolute North Star focus of where, whether it's be an organization or, a company or maybe a military unit or some sort of organization, where they're going, like making those main things the main things are critical. But ultimately, like having too much conviction in some areas can perhaps, lead to a myopic view and not, open up the opportunity for others to provide, firsthand, interesting, feedback and experience. But I think ultimately on the core issues and the core, mission-oriented aspects, having strong conviction is one of the greatest assets that someone can have.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. Kristin, I don't even think I've told you this, but I was coaching someone. They were going into business with someone else. Fortunately, it was early enough for me to intervene, but they were not aligned. They were not aligned at all. So I call it's like pre-marriage counseling. You better find out who's going to do the laundry, who's going to cook. And when we began to break it down, I said, how do you think this is going to play out when you all have to make major decisions? You're not aligned. And we were able to forego that little joint business adventure. I know that's a small scale, but alignment is a powerful thing, and you got to be careful when you get into people that don't have conviction, who will just go as the wind blows, as they say.
Absolutely. I mean, I've talked about even like sponsorships coming my way through social. And I've passed up a lot of money because it didn't align with me. Maybe it wasn't made in the USA, or maybe, it didn't align with my platform and who I am, Christian, country, family, right? So like it is very important that we zoom out and think about that stuff.
Yeah. So, Justin, What did entrepreneurship teach you? Because we want to transfer over to you co-founded RingMD. Mm-hmm. And if you don't mind, just briefly for our audience, explain what that is.
Yeah.
And what was the problem you were trying to solve when you founded RingMD?
Well, I think, at the time, back in the early 2010s, and it's still, a hugely pervasive problem to this day, is that, you have at the time, more than 3 billion people that lacked access to healthcare worldwide. And part of what we were trying to solve, and RingMD, ultimately was a tech company focused on trying to build out the tools that would help enable, governments and healthcare providers to actually fill that gap and actually reach places that maybe traditionally were very difficult to reach at a rural, village level, and in places that, maybe internet connectivity was the only way that you'd be able to reliably access healthcare. So RingMD was started with that purpose in mind, which was how can we connect, the literally hundreds of millions of people all across the globe that lack access to healthcare. And, doing so, of course, that led to, a whole different, slew of ups and downs. Entrepreneurship is not for the faint of heart, for sure. Yeah. But ultimately, I think, the key of the why that RingMD was started was to really go after what I believe is and still is one of the biggest challenges that our world faces, which is lack of affordable healthcare access. It's something, all across America that we face today. And I believe more can and should be done, to connect and provide, Americans, both at home and abroad, but also, folks all across the globe with more reliable and affordable healthcare access.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. I mean, are we talking like remote villages, and what are we, when you say like people are able to, so they have a phone and they're able to get it, is it an app?
How does that work?
How does that work?
Yeah. Well, it started as a website, and then, of course, grew into kind of an app ecosystem. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about going to the places that a lot of others wouldn't dare to go. And, one of our biggest implementations was in India, where we provided software to the government of India and the Digital India Initiative, which their goal was, how do we connect the 800 or so million people that don't have even reliable internet access at the time? And how do we provide common services like healthcare, education, financial services to them? And so, yes, I mean, in many cases, we were going to places where maybe there's a town of, 1 million people, but you have 1 or 2 doctors servicing the entire city. And not even reliable, electricity, let alone internet access and connectivity. And so, I mean, so many stories of, getting very creative of how do we bring, internet connectivity and healthcare to people in rural villages. One example was in rural Pakistan. We, one of our team on the ground literally bought an ambulance, and we had satellite internet connectivity, and we're literally driving to villages and having those, the laptops and the tablets, and basically bringing the doctors to them virtually. So you had to get extremely creative on how to solve that problem.
That's incredible. You've had some experiences. Oh my goodness. That sounds awesome.
Before we jump further, Kristin, I'm just curious, Justin, I can't imagine how many layers, but you had to get government approval. Is that right? Because we know that sometimes entrepreneurship takes a lot of licenses and agreements. Any stories on that? How did that work?
Yeah.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it was incredibly challenging. I mean, across the globe, governments are both the largest payer and provider of healthcare access. And so working with the government was an absolute necessity. At first, we tried to, just bring it directly to the consumer without, government access, and we struggled. And in many cases, we failed because of how critical the government was in paying and providing healthcare access. One example was in Singapore. Doing online video consultations were not exactly illegal, but it wasn't explicitly legal and allowed. So it was kind of a gray area that was ambiguous in the law. And so we had to work with the Singapore Ministry of Health, which then ultimately led to the creation of new laws and a licensing regime of how to actually do this in a safe way. And, of course, for us as from a tech entrepreneurship perspective, it's how do we move fast and just, ship product and get it out in the hands of users as quickly as possible. But, when dealing with governments and especially healthcare, understandably so, there's tons of regulation, tons of compliance. And that was something that, in many ways we were ahead of a lot of the compliance regimes. Now, when we think about, online healthcare is significantly more common, but, rewinding, many years ago, a decade ago, we're a very early first mover in the space.
Wow. Yeah. And is that telehealth? Because I even hear that we have struggles here stateside with telehealth access.
That's right. And so,
wild.
Of course, the pandemic in 2020 really led to the acceleration and adoption of a lot of these, virtual technologies around telehealth and telemedicine. But I mean, for the longest time, the healthcare system has been hesitant to adopt, new innovative technologies in some areas.
Yeah. And I think that there's even like executive orders, or there's something that was just put in place for like an emergency, right? And that's going to expire from what I heard stateside, right? So there's some people that will be cut off their access. And so I can only imagine if that's happening here in the States, what's happening in, so many other countries. I think India, man, they have the largest population in the world. They've surpassed China. It's just absolutely wild. So the fact that you were able to do that and then work with the government, it's just mind-blowing to think about everything that you've gone through to get to where you are now. Really cool.
Yeah. Tons of challenges, but I mean, literally, I can speak for hours about all the different challenges that, entrepreneurship itself, but working with governments and working in some of these, difficult environments. But, the mission is what keeps you going.
Yeah.
I've already told Justin after Johns Hopkins, he's got to write a book. He just has to. Another thing is Justin's probably being modest, Kristin, but I think you're one of the originators of telehealth, and I'm not sure that you get the credit you deserve. But like he said, this was happening way back before people even knew what telehealth was. And I'm sure everyone has their version of HIPAA and all these things. Every country has these restrictions and bureaucracy. So it's amazing what you were able to accomplish there. And we always have naysayers that speak against that. But I can only imagine, we can feel it, right, Kristin? All the obstacles you probably had to overcome.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Our minds are racing right now just thinking about it. And, having an understanding of government, both of us, it's like, come on.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. And by the way, speaking of government, we are going to get into DOGE here soon. Maybe now. Should we go now?
Let's do that now. So, Justin, you served under Elon Musk on the DOGE team. And I think our audience would love to know, number one, how in the world do you end up on DOGE? And everybody wants to know if Elon Musk is a good guy or a jerk. I made that one up. Tell us, number one, a little bit of the journey of getting on the DOGE team, and then what role did you play? Just give us some DOGE stories.
Yeah, for sure. I think, right after President Trump was elected, and of course, even before that, there were folks in the tech community that were throwing around these ideas of, how can we make government, more efficient, more modern, more, frankly, getting back to the purpose, which is to serve the people and do that in a more effective way. And so, after the election, got plugged in with a lot of the folks that were kicking around these ideas, both, from the tech community, but also some policy individuals that were, part of President Trump's both campaign team and then ultimately, the administration. But, there's so many plans that were put in place in that time period from, November and December, prepping as much as possible to just hit the ground running on day one once, President Trump was inaugurated. And I think you saw the speed firsthand there were dozens and dozens of executive orders signed within hours of President Trump being sworn in. And so that culture of really just challenging the status quo and just trying to apply an entrepreneurial and innovative approach to actually like reshape how government acts was ultimately, what attracted me to try to, get involved and then ultimately agree to get involved and do that. I was a critical piece in the early days, focusing on, what does it look like to actually spin up DOGE at the Veterans Affairs, at the Pentagon. And of course, it was a very, very small team, about a dozen or so folks, a little more, as it got closer to the inauguration. But we were kicking around ideas of how do you actually solve this problem and get government to actually get back to serving the people.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So I know, it's funny. We had somebody on recently that was high up within the government, and that was his one thing. He was like, I feel like they move too fast. And I'm like, is there such a thing after the amount of government waste has been discovered? I'm curious what you would say to that. Do you feel like that potentially the mission moved too fast, or is that just too fast for people that are used to moving at a snail pace?
That's a good question. I think, on the one hand, speed was the ultimate advantage. And I think that applies to entrepreneurship as well. A small, lean, agile team is going to be able to, outmaneuver and just out-innovate a larger bureaucratic organization almost any day of the week. That being said, government, there are some areas where government perhaps has some of these checks and balances, rightfully so, to protect, key constituents, to protect key services. That being said, I think overall, on balance, the speed was the biggest advantage.
Yeah.
Sure, a lot of mistakes were made. I mean, that's no secret. But at the same time, I mean, the federal government was an incredibly target-rich environment for waste, fraud, and abuse. You don't spend trillions of dollars a year without encountering, a lot of money that's spent, even if it's not, maliciously spent in a fraudulent way, it could be done in a massively more efficient way. I'll give an example. One of the first days at the VA, literally one of the first days, we discover a contract there was about a dozen or so plants around Secretary Collins' office. And there was a contract for more than $50,000 a year to water the plants.
Oh my gosh.
And you see these things, and it's like the contracting company was coming in like once a month or so to water plants. And so, we canceled that contract, of course, immediately. But, while doing so, we picked up the phone and asked, like, how is this even awarded? Like, how is this even a thing? And all the way, talk to half a dozen people, and all the way down the chain, it's like, oh, well, we needed some plants. We needed someone to service this. And it's like, heck, we'll cancel the contract. I'll water the plants.
Yeah, come on.
And so, that's $50,000 a year, of course, in a multi-trillion-dollar budget is a rounding error. But I think that's such a microcosm for so many of the things that we encountered, which is, frankly, a lot of really inefficient spending. Tons of great people in government, a lot of very mission-focused folks that are doing really good work. And I think that's some area where, perhaps, taking a little bit more time to like more using the scalpel rather than the hammer approach on some of the personnel matters could have been better. That being said, we knew that we had a very limited window to show and prove results to the American people. And if we didn't move quickly, that we would not live up to the president's mandate, which was get government spending under control and let's modernize the government, actually use like real technology to solve some of these problems, not, filling out 30 different paper forms. But, ultimately speed was key.
Oh, yeah. No, I really appreciate you touching on that, because that was something in a very recent interview that came up. I'm just curious. So you uncovered the plants. We didn't hear about that on mainstream media, right? What else? How bad was the VA and other government agencies that you were part of?
I mean, the VA, of course, has an absolutely critical mission, which is providing, services, whether it be healthcare or other benefits to our veterans. I mean, our veterans have, raised the hand, volunteered, and have, frankly, written a blank check to the U.S. government that could be cashed all the way up to include their life. And we, as a country, deserve to honor them in every way possible, and they deserve to get the benefits as quickly and as efficiently as possible. What we found is, a lot of times in government, people will throw, more humans and bureaucratic processes at a problem rather than actually taking a step back to look at what is actually the best way to solve this. And I think a lot of these systems were created, decades ago, and modern technology and modern software systems can automate so many of these things, which would lead to, instead of having dozens of humans involved in approving a veteran's claim, how about automating most of the stuff that can be automated and having the humans focus on the most high impact tasks. And ultimately, it slims it down. I mean, when we got involved in the VA, there were more employees that work for the VA, 500,000, than the active duty U.S. Army.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
500,000 people. And again, the VA has an incredibly important mission, but I think, almost everyone would agree more can and should be done to make sure that the VA operates in a way that honors our veterans, significantly better. And efficiency, not taking a year to approve a claim to actually get the benefits that they deserve. I mean, that's the minimum that we can do to honor our veterans.
Justin, what were these people doing? Like, okay, because we hear nothing but, I mean, for me, from people that have served, I hear like really poor experiences about the VA. What were these 500,000 employees doing?
Well, I mean, a lot of them, of course, are involved in the delivery of healthcare, which of course is an important mission. But there are also, I mean, at the time there was something like, don't quote me on this, but somewhere in the order of magnitude of 25 or so thousand, contracting officers, contracting specialists, and procurement folks. And when you look at like how this bureaucracy unfolds, if you have such a huge amount of contracting folks, that of course leads to, shelling out a lot more contracts. Because what are they doing? They're not necessarily just sitting there doing nothing. I mean, I think many folks there are trying to do their job. I think there is a narrative that like everybody that works in government is, not necessarily there to actually serve the country. I think actually, in fact, most people I encountered were there trying to do the right thing, but they may have lacked the right direction, the right leadership, the right, tools to actually do their job in the most effective way. And so what are they doing? I mean, frankly, creating a lot of bureaucratic processes, because if you're sitting there and you have, 8 hours in your workday and your job is to review certain applications, it's a natural human instinct to fill that time and to make the process more complicated, because the incentives are such that you have to make sure that, you're, showing that you're doing work and showing that you're doing a good job.
Good Lord. Sorry, Ron. I know you're chomping at the bit, but I have to ask you, we have to hear some other stuff. Like, okay, the watering plants is like insane to me. Like, it's like you can't water your own plants outside your office. What else did you find along those lines?
Well, I think, it was so absolutely crazy, and many of these were published on X under the DOGE, handle. And it's like every single day from across government. I mean, there'd be numerous examples posted. And for me, the plant watering story is just absolutely mind blowing. Yeah. But what's even crazier is, when it's shifting over to the Pentagon, is you look at a lot of these consulting companies, and we saw there was a contract for to one of these companies that the end outcome was a PowerPoint presentation, and it was almost $1 million PowerPoint presentation on whether or not we should have electric vehicles, for the Pentagon, and it's one of these things where just the amount of dollars that were going to non-core missions. I mean, at the Pentagon, why is the Pentagon studying electric vehicles? It's not core to warfighting. And for us, it's how do we like take all of this, whether it be across, climate change or environmental studies and all these non-core, functions that are not critical to warfighting. How do we realign those dollars? And ultimately, if any sort of contract was leading to the outcome being a PowerPoint presentation, we should really double click on that and see, is this actually necessary? And should we be spending, $1 million on this PowerPoint presentation and brief?
Oh, and they probably gave him a year to do it too.
And they probably came in over budget and late as well.
Yeah, exactly. That must be the same team that does they were working on transsexual rats or something,
Yeah.
I heard about that.
Hey, Kristin, I wanted to plug in. We had one audience ask this, and it would be the right time. Elon Musk is such a both polarizing, divisive, interesting character. Did you have much time with him? And this person wants to know, what's he like? I know that's a broad question, but what is Elon Musk like?
Yes, as one of the core folks involved, I had a lot of overlap and, almost, near daily overlap multiple times a week with him. From my perspective, he was incredibly focused on the mission, which is key. And I think going back to, your earlier question around, conviction, is that an asset or is that a liability? I think we saw that firsthand in many ways, it was a huge asset, but, being a little bit too focused on being the conviction of how he was trying to approach a certain way of reshaping government that may or may not have been fully aligned with President Trump's view on that, I think ultimately became a liability, unfortunately. But what I witnessed firsthand is someone who was incredibly focused on the mission, but ultimately got a bit distracted from actually what the mission was, which the mission was to actually serve the American people, reshape government, cut the debt, cut the deficit, and actually get the government back to serving the people in the way that it deserves.
Yeah, that's great. And Justin, were you surprised at the controversy of cutting budgets and especially we know that it was on the Democrat side primarily, but they were infuriated by this. And one, from a Huey level view, I thought this might be something that everyone could agree on. Of course, that's being naive. But were you surprised at the level of animosity that was shown toward DOGE?
Oh, absolutely. I never would have imagined, how many threats on my life and others that were involved with DOGE that we would encounter. I mean, we definitely knew there was going to be resistance. We absolutely knew there would be resistance. The level of resistance, although we expected it, was frankly shocking. And the fact that many folks, resorted to attempted violence or in some cases violence to actually, threaten folks that were just trying to, in my view, just trying to serve the American people, to right-size government and to get our spending challenges back from out of control to much more manageable. That being said, I think ultimately a lot of people, the silent majority, actually agreed with a lot of the cuts. I mean, we were not trying to cut anything that was critical. In fact, many of the things, and I think that was kind of the interesting aspect of the posting on X of all the things that we're finding. I mean, I think galvanizing the American people and educating them on, wow, like the government spends $50,000 on watering a handful of plants. It's absolutely crazy. Mm-hmm. And so if that's happening there, what's happening in these billion-dollar programs and these multi-billion-dollar programs across the Pentagon or the VA or elsewhere? It was shocking though. I think a lot came from the left, of course, but I mean, the incentives in Washington D.C. are, the scary thing about it is the incentives in Washington D.C. on both sides of the aisle in some cases are very much aligned with making sure the government spends a whole bunch of money, and frankly, people are able to be on the take, once they leave government. The revolving door is very real, and we saw that firsthand.
I'm curious. Okay, the threats on your life. Are we talking like people that were laid off and they're mad about being laid off? Like, can you dive into that a little bit more?
I mean, even before, even in the first week or two, so before any sort of layoffs, which, I mean, we can talk about layoffs. I think that was a huge misconception, is that DOGE first of all, DOGE could not do anything without the respective cabinet secretary signing off on it. So anybody at DOGE did not have the authority to fire somebody. If somebody were fired, it came from leadership in that organization, which was somebody who was selected by President Trump, confirmed by the Senate, and was running, in this case, maybe the Secretary of the VA, Secretary Collins, or Secretary Hegseth at the War Department. DOGE inherently was like an advisory organization, so to speak, of which is going out and kind of like a special forces team, going and finding, some of these areas where improvements could be made, and then making recommendations. And in many cases, the cabinet secretary maybe would even say no on some of the recommendations. So I think that's one maybe
Oh yeah, they don't talk about those details. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And on the layoffs, I mean, there were, of course, anybody getting laid off is never a popular story, but it is a natural part of any organization to, constantly be trying to upskill and make sure you get the best and brightest people that you can inside that organization. And naturally, some of the bottom performers there's going to be attrition there. Most of the folks that left government left with very, very beneficial financial packages. The deferred resignation plan allowed them to literally stop working, collect a paycheck, until the end of September. So for, 6-7 months of pay, get another job, still accrue, sick days, vacation days.
Oh, wow.
Their health insurance, all of that remained in place for, the next 6 or 7 months. And they could actually go work another job and still collect their normal paycheck, all of their benefits. And so as much as possible, DOGE was trying to come up with creative solutions that would be more of the carrot, the compel to right size, the workforce in that way, and very rarely used the stick, although in some cases there were, reduction in force exercises that, cabinet secretaries approved. But most of people who left, the overwhelming majority, more than 90%, left through voluntary means, and through the lens of what is allowed under the law, from voluntary early retirement to VSIP and some of these other tools. Many walked away with I would say fairly comfortable, financial packages to the maximum extent that was allowed under the law.
And Justin, I don't think I ever heard on the news about a severance package. Did you,
no,
Kristin? I thought
not at all.
They made it sound like people were just cut off and they're starving. And
they showed them carrying their boxes with their little plant.
But I say that to say, Justin, would we agree there might have been some messaging problems in getting the word out appropriately?
100%. And I think, the USAID aspect really, I think, started creating a lot of chaos in the messaging. I think also the personnel aspect, I think the messaging narrative was lost. I think, the left and a lot of the opponents to, President Trump's agenda to right-size the government just flooded the zone with false information. Even to this day, I don't think that story has properly been told. But I always ask the question is how many people were actually fired? And frankly, I think people would be shocked at how few were actually fired. And again, whether or not that was the right policy decision, whether or not, there should have been more, maybe in some cases, more people should have been let go. The ultimate goal, which was not properly messaged, but the ultimate goal was to use the carrot as much as possible, and then only as a last resort for those true bottom performers to use, reduction in force, RIF means.
And Justin, last thing, how much money would you estimate? Did it end up being a savings? Did we revitalize government, or at least bring it into the modern age? Give it a scale of 1 to 10. What do you think the success rate of DOGE was?
I think in the success rate of DOGE, of raising awareness on, how egregious and how inefficient the government historically was an absolute 10 out of 10. I think, across some of these other areas, to what we were just discussing, the messaging, we completely failed on the messaging when it came to personnel. And I think that was something where, because of that, it stalled some of the momentum from some of the really good areas, which was actually, let's just reevaluate kind of how government operates. And it led to things like, at the Pentagon, one of the things that I had the opportunity to work on was software acquisition reform, which it used to take almost 3 years for the Pentagon and the War Department to buy any sort of software, running the whole procurement process. But we got that down to, approximately 3 months, which, may sound still long, but going from 3 years to 3 months for an organization the size of the Department of War is absolutely a huge shift. So overall, I think the awareness was key, and I think it confirmed a lot of what people were skeptical about what was going on in Washington. Some of these grants and the whole NGO nonprofit kind of industry that was surviving off of free government dollars that in many cases was even weaponized in many cases. I think that piece was absolutely mission critical to how DOGE highlighted.
But you mentioned the communication breakdown. Where was that breakdown?
I think because things were moving so quickly, and ultimately, communications was not my primary focus. We were heads down on trying to do the work. But if I had to actually look back in hindsight, I would say ultimately, I think all of us underestimated how much that messaging would go viral around the threat of rifts. And then just the discussion of having any sort of involuntary, separation of employees, that just took off like a wildfire, and it just completely dominated the mainstream media narrative. And I think, it just went so viral that it was quite unexpected, and then it was very, very difficult to combat. And as much as we were trying to combat it with highlighting, all of these wasteful contracts that we were, renegotiating or right-sizing, or in some cases, canceling, ultimately, I think that narrative just went completely mainstream, and it was tough to combat.
Yeah, no, it sounds like some of that communication was out of the control of DOGE, right? The media is going to just run with something. When they see a story, they're going to run with it. They want to invoke emotion, right? So it sounds like a lot of it wasn't that DOGE made a mistake with communication. It's how it was handled by media. Would you agree with that?
Right. And absolutely. And I think ultimately, the media, in many cases, some of these mainstream, media outlets had their own agenda, which was, instead of actually trying to, report on the reality of what was happening, it was such a shock, to their system that, frankly, their bias was very clear that they were just anti anything that was coming out of DOGE or the Trump administration. And so I think that bias was very clear. Ultimately, I think that just overshadowed many of the narratives. And so even some of the positive things that were happening and frankly, billions of dollars saved, I did not see much in mainstream media at all. You saw a lot on X, and a lot of folks, I would say everyday Americans engaging and celebrating that. But from the mainstream narrative, no credit, no real credit was given, and every single thing done was viewed through a negative lens, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Hey, Justin, in retrospect, do you think DOGE should have been a little more bipartisan as far as the people, or at least if it was bipartisan, no one knew it? So it looked like it was a total Trump administration team that's going in and making all these broad changes. Do you think that would have helped in retrospect?
I think nowadays, unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., you just have such a polarized environment, and the incentives are such that actually folks that want to try to do things in a bipartisan way actually get punished from both sides of the aisle. And I think there's this massive, because of a lot of different reasons, but frankly, owning these narratives, collaborating across the aisle is now seen as, in many cases, betrayal. As a negative and a betrayal to your party. And for me, that's one of the most shocking things that I witnessed. And it's something that we, of course, from the outside looking in, we know, but then being on the inside and actually seeing firsthand how prevalent those incentives are to act kind of in a tribal manner around, just loyalty to your party above all, rather than, frankly, loyalty to being an American first and just doing what's right. And I think, a lot of overtures were made from the Trump administration. I was in a lot of those meetings where there was engagement with Congress, and it was open to anybody. Many of those engagement sessions where we went and we were talking to, relevant committees and folks that actually, were creating laws and legislating in these areas, were open to anybody that it was relevant to. And most of the time you would have, there were some exceptions, and I'll give them credit, but the overwhelming majority of people attending were only Republicans. And that's not because the other side of the aisle wasn't invited. It's because, for, like we discussed, various incentives, they were disincentivized from even engaging and entertaining DOGE or the Trump administration. And if they did, they would, of course, be punished.
Yeah. Ron, that was a great question. And Justin, even just here in Oregon the other day, there was a vote on something, and there was a Democrat that was voting along the lines of the Republicans. And another Democrat pulled her in the back room. They talked for 10 minutes, probably was threatened, and then she came out and changed her vote. So, I really do see it. We're at that point, that polarization where it is life-threatening at this point to reach across the other aisle. I mean, there's been a lawmaker potentially, right? There was somewhere in the South where she voted along the lines of the Republicans, and then she turns out murdered, months later. So, and whatever. I don't think that's been confirmed that it was, but it is potentially life-threatening to go against your party. It's wild times.
Well, and Justin, I think you would agree. I think that's happening on both sides. I may feel that one side is right, but I think it's a herd mentality, period, and you better not dissent. Am I wrong on that?
I think you're absolutely right. And, unfortunately, the motive of just doing what's best for America, regardless of party, is something that is so controversial these days. And I think, all of us can really reflect on that, and especially for folks, in elected office in Washington, D.C., can ultimately, get back to those roots. I'm perhaps a little bit of an idealist here, but I do think that a lot of people, maybe raise their hand and volunteer and try to, go to D.C. and serve, and then, the system is incentivized and such where I think it unfortunately corrupts a lot of people, and that tribal mindset takes over. So I'm optimistic. I mean, as we're, coming up on America's 250th birthday, I've been reflecting a lot on, what does it mean to be an American, and what does the future look like? And I think what we've seen, especially over the past year, is there has been a vibe shift in America. If you rewind 18 months or so, I would say there was a lot of reasons to be pessimistic. But I think today it's very obvious that, America's back. I think you see this, from the Pentagon to, recruiting numbers to, just a desire to actually make America better. It's so clear that there's been a vibe shift, and there's so many reasons to be optimistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Man, I love it. I'm an optimist, and I think we've certainly made a lot of progress. And of course, that there's people that it's a lack of understanding, but it appears they don't want America to be successful, and that's a reality that we all have to deal with. Kristin, are we ready to change gears? We may end up making a 2-part series.
I know.
Here.
Well, I did. Okay, I really want to know. Did you get one of those beds? Did you have to sleep there, on site?
Well, I mean, I think that's an interesting part of the narrative is many of the early folks involved with DOGE. I mean, we were sacrificing a lot to put the public service at top of mind. And, part of that was we were working nonstop. And so, there were mattresses strewed about in various government buildings, and perhaps a little bit controversial. Not sure about some of the health codes and some of those sorts of fun compliance regimes, but ultimately it was a nonstop focus on the mission and the work that really went 24/7. And so for months of my life and many others, that was the absolute core singular focus, was how do we serve the American people by trying to right size the government. And so, many a nights, sleeping at the Pentagon or sleeping at the VA headquarters or in other government buildings. But that was all part of the fun. It was
that
a
would be
nice
fun. It's like
camaraderie.
camping. I love that. Did you get so Elon had bought a bunch of those beds, right? That's like they manage your body temperature and all of that. Were you lucky enough to get one of those?
I could have. I think actually there were some ethics questions of whether or not government employees could accept those gifts, and so I was sleeping on a cot. I was sleeping on a cot, which was in the basement of the Pentagon, which was a great honor. It made my commute very easy. Just go up a few floors in the elevator.
It's like being in basic training. It's like nice.
No, I like your attitude, but people don't realize the sacrifice that takes. No matter, there might have been camaraderie, but I know you were exhausted. You probably lived on coffee and
too much.
Yeah,
too much.
Yeah.
Chris and I are patriots. We're sure grateful, Justin, for you and other people that sacrifice like that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
It's quite amazing. So, Justin, we want to transition, but this has been extremely helpful on DOGE. And if you're just joining us, our guest is Justin Fulcher. And what a world that you've experienced at an early age. Justin, we're going to switch. So we've covered RingMD, and you've been an entrepreneur. We moved into government service and DOGE. Let's talk a little bit about, we have a lot of leaders that listen to this podcast. So you've served in both startups and government. What was the adjustment from that fast-moving pace of the private sector? And then, now I get it that DOGE, you did move quickly, but in general, what's the difference in the fast-moving pace of the private sector versus government bureaucracy?
Well, I would say, I think, in general, the private sector can move significantly quicker than government. And I think ultimately one of the things that I learned, though, is, despite, how fast-paced like entrepreneurship is, a lot of times many of these processes and policies were created and they can be changed. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about, our government, is that, things are not necessarily completely, set in stone, some of these policies. And so much of the work that we were trying to do was, for many of these critical processes like procurement, the Pentagon procuring anything was very complicated and would take a long time. And so one of the things that we tried to do was actually look at the root of where some of these challenges were, and then actually reshape and reinvent that system to make it a lot more efficient. And that was part of, taking some of that private sector and entrepreneurial understanding and then apply that to government in a way of actually rethinking how frankly, some of these challenges were that had never really been rethought in some of those ways. And so working in government is definitely, slower pace in some ways. Not that, folks don't work incredibly hard in government. They absolutely do. But bureaucracy is a real thing, and you have to take an active fighting stance against bureaucracy, because America doesn't have an innovation problem. I mean, America is a superpower, but it's running on legacy software. And much of the systems that we're still running today were created decades ago. And I think that was part of what we were trying to fight against and optimize.
Oh, yeah. That's so great. I mean, I still remember Elon Musk talking about, he was like showing how, and there's only one person that works this day, and if they grab it that day, then it will get processed. Wasn't it with like retirements? It was just insane. Absolutely insane. Totally. Okay, so I have to ask you this. How did the opportunity to serve as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense come about?
So I was a key leader at the Pentagon for DOGE and running that team, from the beginning at the Pentagon. And of course, like I was saying before, anything that we did, we were just highlighting recommendations. We had, no explicit authority to, hire people, fire people, or do anything like that. And so, of course, that led to a very strong working relationship with Secretary Hegseth. And, ultimately, through that DOGE experience, worked very closely with him and some of the other folks on his team. And so at that point in time, there came about where, ultimately decided to step away from wearing the DOGE hat, and Secretary Hegseth, very, very graciously offered and extended an invite to join his team and be one of the key folks supporting him and his efforts to, revive the warrior ethos and ultimately, reinvent the Pentagon under kind of this new invigorated model.
Did you ever bench press with him? You go to the gym with him?
we that was something that was always fun, is whenever we travel is seeing actually going and meeting the troops, of course, in the Pentagon. And the Pentagon's great, but it's a little bit stuffy and bureaucratic sometimes, but getting out into the field, whether it be in Hawaii or Guam or the Philippines or anywhere we were traveling, we would always try to spend as much time as we could with the actual troops, on the ground. And usually that involved some sort of physical activity, some sort of workout session. And, that was just an immense honor. But I think part of that culture revitalization is, when is the last time, a cabinet secretary that's run the Pentagon been able to actually, pass the military PT standards? And I think part of that leadership challenge is, if you can't, if you're asking your team members to hold a set of standards that you're not holding yourself, it really begs the question of whether or not you deserve respect as a leader. And I think Secretary Hegseth has obviously led from the front on that topic, which is exciting, and the troops recognize that. It
is exciting, and he benched 350 the other day, like that was insane. So, yeah, they have to be pumped up to have someone like that at the head.
Yeah.
For sure.
Justin, I have to know this for Kristin's sake, did you use any of the moves I taught you while you were traveling?
Karate?
We may or may not have used some of your sparring techniques. You can't confirm or deny that, but no, for sure. And that's always a bunch of fun, right? Is getting out there with the troops and working out, and there were some times where there was some combat involved as part of the workouts, which is always good fun.
Yeah, that's great. So, what else can you tell us about that role as senior advisor that maybe the American public don't get to hear from people like you that often? And I know there was a little controversy in there, but day to day, what's it like being a senior advisor? Are you giving data, or do you just have conversations with him? How does that work?
So, at the time, there were, I believe, four senior advisors. So essentially the closest advisors to the secretary. And, we each had our respective portfolios, and essentially we kind of owned and represented, both, the secretary in terms of like filtering and making sure his priorities are getting executed on, but also, pulling up through the ranks important things that, deserve, highlighting to Secretary Hegseth. And so for us, the Pentagon is a huge organization. I mean, you have nearly 1 million civilians that work for the Department of War, and you, of course, have millions of folks that wear the uniform, and then almost 8 to 10 million contractors that support the military establishment in some way. So a mega organization that spans all across the globe, every single time zone, and assets everywhere. And so that's something where his, protecting his time and making sure he's focused on, the highest priority and the highest impact, highest ROI activities is critical. And so as a senior advisor, within our respective portfolios, that's what we were trying to do. So make sure that, his leadership is getting, pushed out and and really rolled out in the way that he wants across, the folks within the broader organization. And then, of course, highlighting those innovative good ideas in areas where, it may not be easy for someone to pitch him on this idea, but, as his, core team, being able to get out there and highlight those innovative activities. And of course, any time you have, a bureaucratic organization that's as large as the War Department is, there's always challenges, but ultimately, a huge honor to be able to serve and support there. And I mean, frankly, I saw firsthand just how quickly good leadership can transform an organization, even the size of the Pentagon.
Wow.
Yeah, seriously. What surprised you the most once you were inside the building?
Well, I think you kind of understand the size and scale from the outside. I mean, it is, the largest office building in the United States, the Pentagon is.
Wow.
And then you realize there's actually a separate annex as well called the Mark Center, which, has, thousands of more folks off-site as well. So just the size and scale of the Pentagon, it can be quite daunting, and just trying to understand like how you actually reshape some of the systems that have historically, slowed down the pace of innovation. And I think the most surprising thing was just the size and scale of this, but it was also one of the most exciting because many of these policies are able to be changed with, Secretary Hegseth signing a memo and just writing the direction of that organization with even a one-page memo, either retracting or doing something as simple as, hey, every single person here, we're going to start enforcing standards. Here are the standards. Everybody needs to meet them and abide by them. That size and scale, is both daunting, but it's also where the opportunity for immense impact is.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Justin, going into, threats to America, and I don't know what you can discuss, but can you kind of describe what you perceive as the top 3 threats to the United States?
I think ultimately it's incredibly clear that China is the number one adversary of the United States and needs to be treated as such. There's a lot of talk, but more can and should be done to really make sure that peace through strength endures. And I think that's part of why you're seeing this increased defense budget, first $1 trillion budget for the Pentagon. Talks, President Trump has requested and talked about a $1.5 trillion a year budget for next year. China is our primary adversary and threat. 2, I'd be remiss to not talk about, threats to the homeland. I mean, it's incredibly clear, and we've seen this, from the open border policy when you allow anybody to cross the border and military-age males from, dozens of countries around the world. What are they doing here in our country? Are they bringing in drugs? Are they coming in, to commit fraud, to commit crime? What are they doing? And I think the threats to the homeland, and our hemisphere, as we've seen, an increased posture in the Caribbean, in of course, Mexico and Latin America and South America, all of these areas. The homeland threat is real, and making sure that our hemisphere is locked down. One of our first trips I went with Secretary Hegseth was down to Panama, and China had essentially snatched the Panama Canal from right underneath our nose in the previous administration. And so one of the first things that we did was, how do we go and make sure that this vital asset to our national interests are protected? And that's both countering China, but also right in our backyard. And that's something that I think many Americans may not realize is how much China has expanded and operates in and around, even in places like Mexico, and the collaboration with the cartels. And these are threats that are not just in Asia, that are also happening in the homeland. And then finally, I mean, the other threat is bad governance. This is not a foreign threat. It's our bureaucracy that is imposing and slowing our ability to adopt innovation as quickly as possible. We need to increase the institutional velocity of our organizations, our government, to be able to adapt very quickly. I mean, we see this, with drone warfare in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine, every single week, it seems there's new innovations and new technologies that are coming out of that conflict, which, of course, I hope, a peace deal is brokered, as soon as possible. Yeah. But we can't ignore, those sorts of very, asymmetric threats that are constantly being developed and employed on the world stage.
Wow, that's scary, but very interesting, Justin. We appreciate you sharing that, and I can see how each one of those comes into play. Kristin, let's move into segment 3. We put some questions together for Justin.
Yeah, definitely. And just so you know, just hearing that from you gave me chills. It's really, I appreciate you going there, because so many people, they just need to hear it, right? I mean, we have China buying up farmland here in the United States, right? People need to wake up. Okay, segment 3. So your tenure included controversy around your credentials. So from your perspective, what happened?
Oh, I think it's very clear. The mainstream media was doing whatever they could to discredit anybody who was associated with DOGE, for sure, and definitely anybody that was associated with, President Trump's administration. I mean, there's one thing that was, misreported, which is, just cut and dry, is whether or not I was enrolled at Johns Hopkins. It's a very straightforward thing. Provided evidence after the fact and just continued to, keep as is. And so, unfortunately, the mainstream narrative landscape has created this incentivized environment where the truth doesn't necessarily matter as pushing narratives. Yeah. Instead of reporting facts, it's how do we push narratives? And it's ultimately, I think, really unfortunate that, many people are victims of it. And for me, I think, if you've not had any sort of criticism, you've not been in the arena actually, trying to make change. And I say that, for many of the folks that I know have absolutely got destroyed in the media, there are many folks that, absolutely got that only for the primary reason of that they were threatening the status quo and the establishment in some way. And so it's an unfortunate reality of the landscape and the media incentives nowadays. Mainstream media organizations financially are not doing as well as they used to. Of course, with the rise of social media and some of these other platforms like your podcast, and I think ultimately the incentives are such that the truth is up for debate with many of these mainstream narratives.
Yeah,
Spot on.
That's very true. Justin, Kristin knows the story, and it certainly didn't make national news, but I went through some things with the government, with complaints being filed, that type stuff. What would you say to other leaders? As a matter of fact, when I was on the board, the Federal Law Enforcement Accreditation Board, I was talking to a group. These are all academy directors from various federal law enforcement agencies. We started talking. Every single one of them had complaints filed against them. So, and it was 5 or 6, but it it was a little stunning that they had all been through that. When someone goes through that, how did you handle it? Were you able to just gloss over that? Did it bother you? And what would you say to other leaders who are been falsely accused of things?
Yeah.
Well, I think, it's par for the course in leadership that, you're going to face tremendous setbacks at times. And in some of these cases, maybe the setbacks are, justified. And in many cases, maybe they're unjustified. But I think it's like, why are you there? And, for me, what I learned is, keeping the mission front of mind in everything is what propels you and keeps you going forward, despite, perhaps immense criticism from whether it be, employees that, work for you or, mainstream media narratives. But it's just keep up the fight. And frankly, if you're doing this, it means you're challenging the status quo. Yeah. Does it mean you're always right? Maybe not. Of course it doesn't mean that, but it definitely is part of the job. But ultimately, it's managing your own psychology, keeping the mission the main thing, and just constant forward motion.
Justin, when I did see one of the hit pieces, I immediately Kristin doesn't know this, but I prayed for you multiple times, and I sent Justin an immediate text and said, I saw the hip piece, thinking of you, praying for you. How important is it to have people who understand or who support one another, do you think?
Well, I think it's critical, and I've been incredibly blessed to have a great community of folks, and thank you, appreciate your prayers, Ron, and that means a lot. And I think ultimately there are a lot of people praying for me and praying for others in government, and I try to do the same every single day. As anybody who's out trying to make America a better place, trying to serve the American people, I think are deserving of our prayers, and ultimately, that's something where having that core, community of folks that are there to support you is absolutely critical. It can be tough. Leadership is a lonely journey, of course, and in many cases, maybe folks don't fully understand, what that journey is like. But trying to, have that community of like-minded, whether it be entrepreneurs or folks that have some of that shared experience, I think is mission critical.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so important. I'm so glad you're talking about the community aspect of it, because it's like, how many people, I think you reflect when something like that happens to you, or even like me in 2020 when I started speaking out. It's really funny who separates themselves from you and then who actually really appreciates what you're doing, right? So I think it's incredible that it's like you really know who's in your corner when things like this happen. And you can rest easy knowing it's almost like, okay, now I know what these other folks, they're not really in it for being a companion to me or a friend to me. They're in it for maybe my connections or my title or, right? Different things like that. So it's almost a blessing in a sense to have things like that come about. That's my perspective, right? Once you get through it, then you're you can actually look at it and see that some of it's a blessing. I'm curious what the hardest moment during that 6-month stretch was for you.
I think there are many opportunities that we could talk about, but I think ultimately, one of the most challenging times was when we're moving forward, and of course, the Pentagon never sleeps, but ultimately, with some of these challenges and assessing and, always, for example, Operation Midnight Hammer and the contemplations around that, it's always making sure that, we don't, if we have to use force, we make sure that we mitigate, putting Americans in harm's way, and always really just evaluating and taking a step back and making sure that's absolutely necessary before, deploying troops in a way that could harm Americans, and ultimately that's, I think, the hardest balance is sometimes that's required, but how do you do that in the most responsible way? And I think the Trump administration has done that well, but it's never easy.
Yeah.
So Justin, we will continue to move on because we've covered a lot of information. This is almost kind of a one-word answer, but when you left, you resigned from government service, did you feel relief, frustration, clarity? How did that feel?
All the above.
I mean, all the above in many ways, but I mean, humbled. It was an honor of a lifetime to serve the American people in the positions that I did, and I think working with many of the incredible leaders like Secretary Hegseth was a true honor. But ultimately, I originally planned to potentially do 3 months of government service, and ended up being 6 months of government service. And for me, that was one of just frankly the honor of a lifetime. So incredibly humbled.
I love that answer.
Yeah, that was great. And the last part of that, would you change anything, Justin?
A million things, could have done better. But I think ultimately it's just looking back and reflecting and just realizing, I wish I would have taken maybe, how much of an honor it was, like in the moment. It was very easy, working 18, 20-hour days to just, keep plowing through all the different work. But that's where we're at.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. So, Kristin, let's get down to segment 4. You good with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Wanted to talk to you about, like, what is the idea? Actually, Ron, why don't you jump in first? I know you had a good one ready to go.
I would love to hear Justin's thoughts. Is it arrogance? Is it reality? But what is American exceptionalism?
Great
Can
question.
you define that, and what's it mean to you?
I think, American exceptionalism stems from a couple things. One is it's okay to be proud to be an American.
Amen.
And if you look back, since our founding in 1776, we have so many incredible sagas in our history to be proud of. And especially in the more recent modern history, I mean, if you look at the past few decades, I mean, America has led the world in terms of innovation, technology. Pax Americana is a real thing. I mean, if you look at, despite, crazy tension in the Cold War, America kept the peace because of our strong leadership and presence across the globe. And I think getting back to that core ethos of what it means to be an American, and frankly, just being proud to be an American and not questioning whether or not it's okay to show some patriotism, both at home and abroad.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that, because we're made to feel like if we feel proud to be an American, you must be a Nazi, right? Like, it's like, which doesn't make any sense at all, but that's like where we're at. Why would you say that this idea is controversial today?
Well, I think, it's part of it stems from, the post World War II kind of order of after America stepped in and of course, was a critical part in winning World War II. And then, this new order that was, new order led by America, globally. I think in many ways we got a little bit complacent, and we started out of the goodness of our hearts. We started doing a lot of things like opening our borders. I don't think a lot of these policies started with negative intent. Immigration is not fundamentally wrong, but I think we lost sight of actually what it means to be an American, and part of why that's controversial is, which I don't think it should be, but we should be optimizing in America. We should be optimizing for the interests of what matters most for America. And this concept of America first, of course, gets massively criticized by the mainstream media, but I would summarize it very simply, which is we're going to finally put the interests of America first. It doesn't mean America's alone on the world stage, but it means that at the end of the day, America's interests trump all.
No, that's great. And every other country does it, or at least most developing country.
It's pretty
developed
common
countries
sense.
do it. Yeah. So, Justin, moving on down, let's move over to a little bit of optimism here for a minute. What are we getting right that the public doesn't appreciate?
Oh, I think the level of sophistication of our military, of our national security establishment is absolutely incredible. There are so many, whether it be attacks on the homeland or abroad, that are stopped every single day because of the silent professionals that are working behind the scenes, getting very little credit. That both our technology and our capabilities, but also our people, which sets us in a category of our own. And I think more can and should be done to highlight both these incredible capabilities that America has, but also the incredible people, which are ultimately our top asset.
Did you get a chance to meet Joe Kent while you were in D.C.?
I did. He's of course doing absolutely incredible work, and I know he comes from your part of the country.
Yeah, he's one of my I could say friends loosely. I helped on his campaigns, right? Like, he lives right out here, but that's so awesome because that's what he's doing every day, right?
Yeah, he's doing great work at NCTC, and ultimately, I can't think of a better person to be in that leadership position. He's done a ton to transform that.
He really has.
So, Justin, let's talk a little bit about faith. Kristin, you've got a great question.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we could use today more than ever. How should leaders integrate faith without alienating others? That's tough in
Well,
government.
I think you know, of course, you know, in government that can be difficult. But I think ultimately, you know, how does your faith look in action? I mean, it's how you speak, it's how you interact with others, it's how you evaluate decision making. And I think there's lots of ways that you can show your faith without, you know, throwing it in people's faces in terms of lecturing them. But, you know, it's the simple question, you know, the old, you know, WWJD bracelets. I had one, you know, I used to wear one when I was a kid.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about those.
Right?
Yes.
And it's one of those things where it's like, what would Jesus do? And it's just trying to live that out. And of course, you know, I'm the furthest thing from Jesus possible. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think we all can, and you know, people of faith, we can all, you know, put that on display, with our actions rather than just our words. And of course, you know, like I said, I'm absolutely far from perfect and incredibly, you know, a lot of work to be done in my life. But at the end of the day, it's not being afraid to put that on display. And if people ask about it, feel free to share. You know, of course, you know, government environments, you know, you respect the policies and all that. But you know, it's easy to do that outside of work as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Hey, Justin, what would you say to a young person? Maybe they're junior, maybe they're freshmen in college, but they're considering government service or public service. What would you say to them?
Do it. I think many people, if you look at, you know, post World War II and 1950s, 1960s, I think historically the U.S. government attracted the absolute best and brightest. And it was such a high prestige activity to serve your country. And I don't know where that changed. You know, maybe we can point to, you know, the 90s or early 2000s or around that time. But it seems like since the past few decades, that prestige and that desire to serve in government has waned a bit. And I think, you know, especially with young people and with the rise of, you know, so much like defense tech, you know, in the War Department and all these new convergence of technology, innovation, and government, there's never been a better time to serve. And I would say do it, because it's the honor of the lifetime, in my view, to serve in government and to serve the American people and to try to make our country, you know, as great as we can be.
I 100% agree with that. I certainly have no regrets in the career trajectory that I took. So, Justin, for time's sake, and this has absolutely been amazing, but we do have a few rapid-fire questions to kind of take us home. So cool. We're going to hit these kind of quickly, if that's okay. And Kristin is going to start us off.
Yeah. Okay, what's the biggest misconception about the Pentagon?
Well, the Pentagon doesn't lack innovation. It just lacks institutional velocity.
All right.
I love it.
Yeah.
Justin, what's some leadership traits that you've seen that destroy careers?
I think it's ego. It's putting yourself above the mission.
It's beautiful. What's one book that every leader should read?
Careful here, Justin. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
The Dirty Side of Leadership.
I do recommend that book for sure. Many people, I've given it as a gift to many people. But I would say an unorthodox one is a book called The Fish That Ate the Whale.
Oh, to look into that.
I'm writing that down. I don't think I know that one. So, great.
You're in for a treat.
I'm reading Lewis and Clark right now, and it's been amazing.
Wow.
My neighbor's over here.
Yep. Go ahead, Kristin.
Okay. What's a moment that humbled you?
On our first trip to the Philippines with Secretary Hegseth, we went to the American Cemetery in Manila. And, you know, many people, of course, know Arlington, and it has a similar kind of somber atmosphere of, you know, thousands of white gravestone markers. And that was just such a humbling experience to reflect on, you know, those troops that laid down their lives in World War II. And it was just an incredibly moving experience.
I can imagine.
Gosh.
I know.
So, Justin, this maybe is two-part, still rapid fire, but what do people misunderstand about you, do you think, especially based on some of the media reports?
Well, I think I think people don't realize like that DC is so full of selfish people that, the altruistic desire, to try to save and serve the country is hard for people to understand. And I think there's a lot of projection around their own motives, whether it be, their own, financial motives or otherwise, around narratives that, just the act of wanting to serve and, serve for a limited period of time and then get back, to work in other areas is so hard for people to fathom.
I love it. And Justin,
that.
if you don't mind, tell us what you're doing and what's next for you. You've lived the life of 10 people. So
I know.
What are you doing and what's next in your life?
I'm trying to be maximally, helpful to a lot of these, core issues I was working on the inside, trying to continue to help, bridge the gap between the government and the tech sector, for example, with, adopting, the latest and greatest innovation and technologies and, trying to help, translate how to navigate some of that bureaucracy to other, tech companies and other defense tech companies as well. But ultimately, it's a continuation of the mission I was serving on the inside.
That's exciting.
Good.
Yeah. We could go like for another half hour here, but we've already ran over what we told you we were going to be an hour. We've been an hour and a half. You're just such an interesting individual. And we appreciate your time so much, Justin. If you could leave our audience with one main takeaway, I know it's near impossible, what would you give them?
I would say, pick big missions to focus on and go in all the way. Right now it seems like America's best and brightest are disincentivized from going into government, for example. And I think that's one of the key problems is it's cool to serve your country again. And in whatever way that works for you, with your skills that you've been blessed with and the ways that you want to contribute, don't be ashamed of wanting to serve your country and serve our community in whatever way you can.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Justin, you have to promise you'll come back sometime on the podcast.
Yes.
Would love to.
And to our leaders, I think some themes that we all need to take away is leadership isn't always polished. It isn't always fair, and it rarely comes without a cost. But it's in the tension that character is revealed, and there's nothing greater than serving your country.
Amen to that.
That's beautiful. I love that. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, especially to this 2-part series today. Don't forget, you can write us. You can suggest something for us to dive into in the leadership spectrum. And you can DM us. We're very available to you guys. So like, share, and follow. We appreciate you.
That's right. And thank you, Justin.
Yes.
All right, everybody. Be the leader you're meant to be.
We'll see you next week.
The Dirty Side of Leadership podcast is brought to you by Forward Operations. If you'd like to book Ron or Kristin for speaking events, training, or executive coaching, visit forwardoperations.com. Be the leader you're meant to be.